She did not flinch. That was what no one would remember. Later. Not the way the candles guttered in the draft from the open window. Not the way the soup had gone cold in her bowl. Not even the word itself, which hung in the dining room like smoke after a fire. What no one would remember was that Mirabelle. No, that was not her name. The woman at the table was called Theodora Voss, and she had been called many things in her 24 years on this earth. But she had not, until that Tuesday evening in October, been called plain by the man she had married. He said it the way men said things they believed were simply true, not cruelly, exactly. More the way one observes that a horse is slow or a field is rocky. A statement of fact, offered to the table at large, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been contradicted by anyone whose opinion he values. Theodora has never been what you would call handsome, Harlan said, reaching for his wine. But she manages well enough in other regards. He was speaking to his cousin, Bertram, who had arrived that afternoon with his new wife, a pretty woman named Cecily, who had the good grace to look immediately at her plate. Theodora set down her fork. Not loudly, not with any particular drama. She simply set it down, and looked at her husband across the white linen, and something inside her, some last small thing she had been carrying without knowing its name, went perfectly, absolutely quiet. She had come to the Aldgate house as a bride 18 months ago, in a carriage that smelled of cedar and old wool. Her father, Mr. Voss of Harrowfield, had arranged the match with the kind of efficiency he brought to all business matters, which was considerable. Harlan Aldgate was a man of property in Harwick County, Virginia. He was 31. He was respectable. He was solvent. These were, her father explained, the relevant facts. Theodora had not asked about love. She was practical enough to know that love was not a relevant fact in the Voss household. What she had not anticipated, what no one had prepared her for, was Harlan's mother. Mrs. Aldgate, Eleanor Aldgate, née Marsh, was a woman who had spent 62 years perfecting the art of the quiet wound. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply observed, in a voice like dried lavender, that the silver had been polished incorrectly, that the roses Theodora had arranged for the parlor were the wrong variety for the season, that her daughter-in-law's handwriting showed a troubling want of discipline. Your mother must not have had the leisure to attend to such things, she said once, over tea, in a tone that suggested this was a great pity. Theodora had smiled and poured another cup. That was what she did in those first months. She smiled. She managed. She learned the house. Its drafty east corridor, its pantry that smelled of damp, its particular rhythm of meals and callers, and the long, silent evenings when Harlan read in his chair and did not look up. She ran the household with a steadiness that Mrs. Aldgate could not fault, though she found other things to fault instead. Theodora's posture at the piano, her preference for plain muslin over silk, the way she laughed too freely when the tenant farmer's children ran through the yard. It is not seemly, Mrs. Aldgate said. A woman of your position. Harlan said nothing. He rarely said anything, except to agree, at intervals, that his mother had a point. What Theodora had not understood in the early months was that Harlan's silence was not neutrality. It was a kind of compliance. He had grown so accustomed to his mother's voice filling the available space that he had never learned to occupy it himself. He was not a cruel man, she thought. He was an unfinished one. She had tried in the quiet ways available to her to reach him. She had asked about the farm. He had opinions about the soil and the Southfield's drainage that he shared, when asked, with a kind of cautious pleasure, as though surprised to be consulted. She had suggested they take supper alone on Thursdays, and he had agreed, and for 2 months they had done so, and sometimes it had been almost easy between them. Then Mrs. Aldgate's rheumatism had confined her to the downstairs bedchamber for a fortnight, and she had required company at the dinner hour, and the Thursday suppers had ended, and Harlan had not thought to revive them. Theodora had told herself it was enough. She had a house. She had useful work. She had the small freedoms she carved out for herself. The morning walk along the creek road. The correspondence she kept with her friend Nettie Bourne in Richmond. The books she ordered from the lending catalog in town. She told herself that many women had far less and called it a life. She had almost believed it. And then came October, and Bertram, and the dinner and the word. Plain. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the room she had shared with Harlan for 18 months. He slept heavily, undisturbed, which told her everything she needed to know about the weight of his conscience, and she looked at the ceiling and did something she had not permitted herself to do in a very long time. She thought clearly, not about Harlan's faults, not about her own unhappiness. She had spent considerable energy, over the past year and a half, avoiding exactly those thoughts, the way one avoids a loose board on the stairs. This time, she did not avoid them. She lay in the dark, and she let herself see the shape of her life as it was, not as she had been working to make it. This was what she saw: a woman who had made herself useful in a house that did not belong to her, for people who did not value her, for a marriage that was not one. She was 24 years old. She thought about her friend Nettie, who had written in her last letter about a woman in Richmond who ran a boarding house and a small school combined. A Mrs. Holroyd, Nettie had said, who was looking for a capable assistant, who could handle correspondence and manage the household accounts, and occasionally sit with the younger students. Nettie had added, in her careful handwriting, "I mention it only because I know you have always been fond of teaching, and because, forgive me, Thea, I have sometimes wondered, from your letters, whether you are quite happy." Theodora had folded that letter and put it in the back of the small cedar box, where she kept things she was not ready to consider. She got up and took it out now. She sat at the writing desk in the dark, with one candle, and she read Nettie's letter again. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper. Then she wrote. She wrote to Mrs. Holroyd, whose address Nettie had included in a postscript, as though she knew it might be needed. She wrote carefully and honestly that she could manage household accounts and correspondence with accuracy, that she had experience with children aged 6 through 12, that she was prepared to be useful in whatever capacity was required. She did not mention Harlan. She signed the letter Miss T. Voss, her maiden name, almost without deciding to. Then she opened the cedar box again and counted what was there. Her grandmother's brooch, which could be sold. $41 she had accumulated over 18 months from the household allowance, carefully kept, never mentioned. A small pearl earring she had found in the garden and not reported, which was worth perhaps $2 more. It was not very much. It was enough. She packed a trunk. She worked quietly, with the methodical calm of a woman who has already decided and does not need to decide again. The dark dresses, the good wool shawl, the books she could not leave, her mother's Bible, the cedar box. She left the silk gowns. They had been bought for Harlan's wife, and she was done with that office. By 4 in the morning, the trunk was by the door. She dressed herself, which took longer than usual without a maid. She pinned her hair. She put on her traveling coat and her good boots, and she stood for a moment in the room, looking at the shape of her husband asleep in the bed. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected grief, or guilt, or the peculiar vertigo of a woman abandoning her life. Instead, she felt only a very quiet steadiness, as though some part of her had been waiting, without her knowledge, for exactly this. She left a letter on the writing desk. It said, "I have gone. I will not be returning. Please do not look for me on account of grief, as I am not grieving. I hope you will be well." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever written in that house. She walked down the back stairs, through the kitchen. The cook was not yet up, and out into the cold October morning, where a hired wagon she had arranged 2 days ago through the stable boy was waiting at the end of the lane. She did not curtsy, she simply walked. Mrs. Holroyd's establishment in Richmond occupied a tall brick house on a street of similar houses, with a sign by the door that read Holroyd House. Lodging in letters, terms reasonable. It was not elegant. It smelled of beeswax and old paper, and on Thursdays, of baking bread from the kitchen below. Theodora arrived on a Wednesday, with her trunk and her $43, and her letter of introduction from Nettie, and Mrs. Holroyd, a short, round-faced woman of about 50 with spectacles on a ribbon and ink permanently staining her right forefinger, looked her up and down once and said, "Can you do 3 columns of figures in your head?" "Yes," Theodora said. "Can you manage 6 children simultaneously without raising your voice?" "I have never had occasion to try 6, Theodora said. "I have managed 4. "Good enough," said Mrs. Holroyd, and showed her to a small clean room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked over the back garden. Theodora stood at that window for a long moment after Mrs. Holroyd had gone, looking at the bare branches of a sycamore tree in the October air. She felt, and this surprised her, something she had not felt in a considerable time. Something so simple she had trouble naming it. She felt, standing in that small room, like herself. The work was real, and it was plentiful. Mrs. Holroyd ran a house with 12 lodgers, a small classroom for 8 children of the neighborhood, and a correspondence service for women who needed letters written in a clean professional hand. Theodora managed the accounts, helped with the children from 8 to noon, and wrote 2 or 3 letters each afternoon at the long table in the front room. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. At the management of details, at the patient work of keeping things running. The difference was that here, the work was seen. Mrs. Holroyd said "well done" when it was done well, and meant it. The lodgers thanked her when she sorted a billing confusion. One of the children, a boy of 8 named Fletcher, stayed after lessons one morning to show her a drawing he had made, and his small, serious face when she praised it was the best thing she had seen in a year and a half. She wrote to Nettie every week. She did not write to her father. She did not write to Harlan. She had been at Holroyd House for 3 weeks when the first letter arrived. It was from Harlan's solicitor, a Mr. Pendleton, whose name she recognized from the estate documents she had filed in the study at Aldgate. The letter was brief and formal. It informed her that Mr. Aldgate wished to discuss the matter of her absence and requested that she present herself at the offices of Pendleton and Crane at her earliest convenience. Theodora read it twice. Then she set it aside and finished the household accounts, which showed a discrepancy of $1.14 that she tracked to an error in the October coal invoice. She wrote back to Mr. Pendleton. She was not able to present herself at his office, but she was prepared to conduct any necessary correspondence in writing. The second letter came from Harlan himself. She knew his handwriting, large, slightly awkward, the writing of a man who had done it dutifully rather than often. The letter was longer than she expected. He said she had alarmed the household. He said his mother was distressed. He said he did not understand what he had done that was so severe. He said he would be grateful if she would return and discuss the matter as adults. He did not say he was sorry. Theodora noticed this with the same calm with which she had been noticing things for 18 months. She filed the letter in the cedar box. She did not reply. The third letter was from Mrs. Aldgate. This one surprised her. It was not what she had expected. Not a demand, not a rebuke, not a litany of Theodora's inadequacies. It was, in its way, almost a confession. Mrs. Aldgate wrote in the tight, careful script of a woman who had been raised to believe that legibility was a moral quality. She wrote that the house had been disordered since Theodora left. She wrote that Harlan was not eating regularly. She wrote that she was old and her rheumatism was worsening, and that she had not. Here the handwriting altered slightly, as though the pen had hesitated. She had not always been kind. That was all. She did not say she was wrong. She said she had not always been kind. Theodora read it 3 times. She thought about what it cost a woman like Eleanor Aldgate to write those words. She thought about how long it must have taken her. She thought about the tight, frightened way pride worked in people who had never been shown how to put it down. She did not write back immediately. She waited 4 days. Then she wrote to Mrs. Aldgate, not to say she was returning, but to say that she had read her letter, and that she understood it. What came next surprised everyone, including Theodora. It was Harlan who came to Richmond. He appeared at the door of Holroyd House on a Thursday morning in November. She knew it was a Thursday because the bread smell was particularly strong. Wearing his traveling coat and his hat at an angle that suggested he had not thought carefully about his appearance, which was, she knew, unusual for him. Mrs. Holroyd came to find Theodora in the classroom, where she was helping Fletcher with his arithmetic, and said with careful neutrality that there was a gentleman asking for her. Theodora took her time finishing the problem with Fletcher. Then she washed her hands. Then she went to the front room. Harlan was standing by the window, holding his hat, looking out at the street. He turned when she came in. He looked, and she noticed this immediately, like a man who had been sleeping badly. Like a man who had been looking at something he did not previously have language for, and still did not, but could no longer look away. "Theodora," he said. "Harlan," she said. She did not sit. She did not offer him tea. He was quiet for a long moment. "You look well," he said, and then seemed to hear himself say it, and for the first time in her memory he colored. "I am well," she said. "Thank you." Another silence. He turned his hat in his hands. She had never seen him nervous before. She had not known he was capable of it. "I said something," he began. "At the dinner. Something I should not have said." "Yes," she said. "I did not mean." He stopped. "That is not true. I am not certain what I meant. I know it was wrong. I know it." He looked at her directly, which was also unusual. "I have been sitting in that dining room for 3 weeks thinking about the way you put down your fork." "What about it?" she said. "You did not argue," he said. "You did not cry. You simply stopped." He looked for a moment, quite lost. "I have been thinking about what it means for a person to simply stop." Theodora considered him. She thought about the 18 months she had spent in that house. She thought about the Thursday suppers. She thought about the way he had, occasionally in those moments, been almost the person she had hoped for, and the way that person had always been crowded out by the time his mother needed something. "Harlan," she said, "why did you come here?" "Because I have been a fool," he said, with a plainness that startled her more than she expected. "And because I believe, I have been doing you a very great wrong without knowing it, and now I know it. And I don't know what to do with that except to come and say so." She looked at him for a long time. "Your mother wrote to me," she said. He blinked. "She did?" She said she had not always been kind. Something moved across his face. It was complicated, surprise, and then something older, something that might have been a grief he had been living with for longer than either of them knew. "No," he said quietly. "She has not. Have you ever said that to her?" The silence this time was very long. "No," he said. "I have not." Theodora walked to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the November street. Two women with market baskets, a dog asleep in the pale sun. "I am not unhappy here," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have work I am suited for. I have a room of my own. Mrs. Holroyd says I have a talent for the children, and I believe I do." She paused. "I am not miserable without you, Harlan. I want to say that clearly so there is no misunderstanding." "I understand," he said, in a voice that suggested he was not certain he deserved otherwise. "But I am also," she said more slowly, "not certain that what we had was what a marriage should be." She turned to look at him. "I am not asking for declarations. I am asking whether you are prepared to build something different. Because if you are only here to collect me back, the way one collects a horse that has gotten out, I will walk with you to the door, and wish you a safe journey." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not here to collect you. Then why are you here?" He looked at her, with that lost look, and for the first time she thought she saw through it, to whatever it was that lived underneath. "Because I have been thinking," he said, "about who I would be talking to for the rest of my life, and I could not find a single answer that I preferred to you." It was not, perhaps, what a woman of her time was supposed to want from a declaration. It was not poetry. It was not sweeping. It was the kind of thing a man said who had spent 32 years learning very little about how to want something, and was only now beginning to understand that he had. She found, to her own surprise, that it was enough. Or rather, not enough by itself, but a beginning. She did not return immediately. She told him she needed 2 more weeks, and she could see him calculating whether to argue and deciding not to, which was itself a small thing but notable. She told him she would return under 3 conditions: that she would continue to manage the household accounts in her own name, that Thursday supper would be restored, without interruption, as their time alone, and that he would speak to his mother. "About what?" he said. "About the way she speaks to me," Theodora said. "About the way she has always spoken to me. I will not ask you to choose between us. But I will ask you to stop being absent. If she says something unkind, I need to know you will say something in return." He was quiet for a long time. "She is not easy to." "I know she is not easy," Theodora said. "I have spent 18 months learning exactly how not easy she is. I am not asking you to shame her or to make her cry. I am asking you to be present. To be there, in the room, when it happens, so that I am not facing it alone." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "I can do that." She looked at him carefully. "Can you? Because I will go home with you, Harlan, if you can. But I will not go home to the same house I left." "No," he said quietly. "I don't want that either." She believed him. It was not certainty. She had been wrong before about what to believe. But she was 24 years old, and not without courage. And she had walked out of one life in the dark of a cold October morning. If she needed to, she thought, she could do it again. 2 weeks later, she packed her trunk a second time. Mrs. Holroyd walked her to the door. She pressed Theodora's hand and said nothing, which was the right thing, and then she said, "You know where the room is if you need it," which was also the right thing. Theodora rode back to Harwick County in a hired carriage that smelled, again, of cedar and old wool. The fields were bare now, the trees stripped, the sky that particular gray of late November in Virginia. She watched it pass and thought about all the things she was returning to, and then she thought about the things that would be different. The carriage turned up the long lane to Aldgate. The house was lit, more lit than she had ever seen it, all the front windows bright against the evening. As the carriage slowed, she saw the door open. Harlan came out, but it was not Harlan she watched. Behind him, moving more slowly, gripping the doorframe with one hand, came Mrs. Aldgate. Eleanor Aldgate, in her gray wool and her good brooch, standing on the threshold of the house she had governed for 30 years, looking out at the carriage. Theodora could not see her face clearly in the fading light. But she could see that she was standing there, that she had come out to the door. That was not nothing. Theodora descended from the carriage without being handed down. She walked up the path. She stopped a few feet from the door, and she looked at her mother-in-law, and Mrs. Aldgate looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched out longer than such moments usually do. Then Mrs. Aldgate said, "The supper will go cold," which was, Theodora knew, as close as Eleanor Aldgate had ever come, or would likely ever come to welcome back. She went inside. The supper did not go cold. She ate it at the dining room table, in the chair that was hers, and the candles burned steadily this time, and there was no wind through the window, and no word she needed to survive. Harlan passed her the bread without being asked. His mother sat at her end of the table and said nothing about the posture, said nothing about the roses, said nothing at all except to remark, at the end of the meal, that the weather had turned. It has, Theodora agreed. After supper, she went upstairs alone to unpack her trunk. She set the cedar box on the writing desk. She placed her mother's Bible on the side table. She put the books back on the shelf in the order she preferred. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark yard, the bare sycamore, the cold November sky with its wash of stars. She was not certain what the next year would bring. She was not certain that Harlan would remember, every time, to be present. She was not certain that Mrs. Aldgate's ceasefire would hold, or deepen into something that resembled peace. She was not certain of any of the things that women in her position were supposed to be certain of. But she had unpacked her trunk on her own terms. She had come back because she had chosen to, not because she had nowhere else to go. And somewhere in that difference, in the quiet, particular weight of a choice freely made, she found something that felt very much like solid ground. She turned from the window. She smoothed her dress. She went back downstairs to where her husband was waiting, and she sat down across from him, and she said, "Tell me about the south field. You said the drainage was worsening." He looked up. For a moment, something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Something uncertain, and glad, and quietly amazed, the way a man looks when he realizes he has been given back something he did not know, until he nearly lost it, that he valued. "It is," he said. And he told her.